Steve Martin has built his career on elegance and wit, delivered with surgical timing. Comedy cut from restraint instead of chaos. He never had to raise his voice. His sharpest lines were always the quietest. For decades, Martin mastered subtle rebellion, from the jerk to Roxanne, father of the bride, to only murders in the building. Brilliance came from control, never allowing the joke to outrun the rhythm. And behind that control lies memory of actors who broke it, scenes that tilted, and people who, to him, were not just co-stars, but disruptions. Comedy is a delicate thing. Timing, trust, rhythm. When that trust fractured, Martin didn't shout about it. He remembered. And sometimes, remembering looked a lot like dislike. He had admired hundreds, but a few left scars. Some clashed on set, others clashed off the set, while some never even made their way in front of the camera. Here are 6 actors Steve Martin admitted or, at the very least, implied he hated the most, and why their names still carry weight in his story. Number 1, Chevy Chase. When Steve Martin crossed paths with Chevy Chase, the clash was not in dialogue. It was in personality. Both men were Saturday Night Live alumni in spirit, though Martin returned as host, while Chase was an original cast member. They often shared the same stages and late-night circuits, but Martin once joked that Chevy's arrogance was the joke no one could laugh at. Their rivalry was never about one fight. It was a quiet recognition that both comedians worked in different universes. Martin in precision, Chase in chaos. The tension began in the late 1970s, when Martin was redefining stand-up with his surreal, controlled absurdism, and Chase was Hollywood's most bankable comedy star. His reputation preceded him. Crew members described him as cutting sarcastic, someone who thought timing was about domination, not generosity. Martin's career was built on restraint, and that energy was toxic to him. Privately, he joked that Chevy could clear a room faster than his punchlines. Their names circled each other often. Studios would float Chase as a co-star for Martin's projects, but it never happened. Martin didn't need the chaos, the sharp elbows, or the ego. He needed rhythm, trust, and respect, things Chevy rarely offered. Insiders whispered that during the making of Three Amigos, Chase's involvement nearly derailed the chemistry. Martin reportedly kept the peace by tightening the script and limiting improvisation, knowing Chase would wander if left unchecked. Chevy Chase did well with disruption. Steve Martin did well with balance. Put them together, and the set tilted. Martin never hollered about it or engaged in public feuds. Instead, he did the talking through silence. The silence of never again pairing with Chase outside of contractual obligation. The silence in interviews where Chase's name never appeared. In the end, it wasn't about fights or fireworks. It was two philosophies of comedy colliding. To Martin, precision was art. To Chase, arrogance was the punchline. To Steve Martin, that was a joke that never landed. Number 2, John Belushi. Martin respected wildness when it served comedy, but John Belushi's recklessness unnerved him. When Martin hosted Saturday Night Live during Belushi's tenure, he often found himself overwhelmed by Belushi's unpredictable energy. In interviews, Martin hinted that Belushi was a force which he could admire from a distance, but never collaborate with deeply. Belushi's excess, his storm of drugs and impulsivity, stood in direct contrast to Martin's crafted, disciplined style. SNL, in the late 1970s, was a crucible. Belushi ruled the stage with unfiltered power, whether as a raging samurai, a swaggering blues brother, or a man who could turn silence into chaos with one manic glare. Yet that same unpredictability made rehearsals volatile. Martin, whose comedy thrived on polish and timing, often described Belushi's process as jumping without a net. He admired the courage, but feared the crash. Behind the scenes, stories spread about Martin's discomfort. Belushi's drug use was well known, and his reputation for late arrivals, last-minute changes, and storm-like entrances clashed with Martin's meticulous approach. Where Belushi electrified a live audience, Martin saw the toll it took on the rhythm of the ensemble. Comedy, to Martin, was collaboration. For Belushi, it often felt like combat. There was mutual respect. Martin acknowledged Belushi's genius in interviews, at one point even calling him a thunderclap of talent. But he also made clear that genius without restraint was dangerous. He once said Belushi reminded him of a jazz soloist who never knew when to stop playing. On live television, that unpredictability might thrill viewers, but for Martin, it drained trust. The divide was philosophical. Martin sought to craft comedy that lasted beyond the moment. Belushi lived inside the moment, no matter the cost. Their paths diverged quickly, with Martin moving into film roles built on structure and Belushi burning brighter and shorter than almost anyone in his era. To Steve Martin, John Belushi embodied everything comedy could be, and everything it could destroy. The admiration stayed, but so did the distance. Number 3, Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis was a comedy titan Martin grew up with, but admiration never translated into affection. Pressed for influences, Martin would frequently invoke the names of Jack Toddy or Buster Keaton, but he conspicuously sidestepped Lewis. Insiders said Martin couldn't abide Lewis's arrogance, which extended to how he treated younger comics. For Martin, comedy wasn't domination, it was generosity. And Lewis, late in life, embodied the opposite. Lewis was everywhere in Martin's youth. The Nutty Professor and the Bellboy defined American slapstick for an entire generation. But for Martin, the lessons he took from those films were about excess, what not to emulate. His own stand-up, minimalist and surreal, stood in direct contrast to Lewis's mugging and exaggerated chaos. Martin leaned into silence, banjo strings, and absurd understatement. Lewis leaned into volume. The difference became philosophy. As Martin entered the Hollywood spotlight, questions about Lewis followed him. Reporters often asked if Jerry had influenced his act. Martin's replies were evasive, even cold. He would pivot to Keaton, whose stone face taught him timing, or to French masters like Jacques Toddy, whose visual subtlety inspired the jerk. Lewis, whose influence was undeniable to many, was carefully erased from Martin's story. Behind the frame, stories spread about their distance. How Martin reportedly bristled at Lewis's reputation for bullying younger comedians and dismissing their work as inferior. That kind of hierarchy contradicted Martin's ethos. Comedy to him was collaboration, a generosity of timing and space. By the 1980s, Lewis had become infamous for dismissing the new wave of comics, a wave Martin was helping lead. The irony is that both men sought immortality through comedy, but their visions clashed. Martin built his legacy on control, grace, and respect. Lewis clung to bravado, insisting on his crown even as the culture shifted. To Martin, the arrogance was not only unappealing, it was the very opposite of what comedy should be. And that's why Jerry Lewis, for all his power, never found a place in Steve Martin's pantheon. Number 4, Bill Murray. Bill Murray and Steve Martin indeed shared a sharp, dry sensibility, but they also shared tension. Stories swirled that during the Saturday Night Live crossover years, Martin found Murray dismissive and hard to align with in sketches. Murray's refusal to rehearse, his habit of winging it, grated on Martin's sense of structure. They never openly feuded, but those who worked with them remembered the coolness, like two masters circling the same space, refusing to yield. Murray's comedy was instinctual. He thrived on improvisation, slipping sideways into a scene and daring others to catch up. Martin, by contrast, built every moment like a watchmaker, precise and deliberate. On a live stage, those approaches could easily collide. Insiders said Martin once walked out of an SNL rehearsal, muttering that Murray did not read timing, he bent it. For Martin, comedy was not about overpowering, it was about balance. And Murray, brilliant though he was, often upset that balance. Their parallel careers only deepened the contrast. Martin was making tightly constructed film comedies like The Jerk and Roxanne, based upon control and timing. Murray was reinventing irreverence in Caddyshack, Stripes, and eventually Ghostbusters, where his improvisation became legend. The culture celebrated Murray's looseness, but Martin watched it from a distance, skeptical of its sustainability. The closest they came to collaboration was through ensemble projects and charity benefits, their paths crossing without ever locking into rhythm. Colleagues noticed a difference in energy. Martin rehearsed lines until they landed like poetry, while Murray seemed to roll out of bed and let instinct dictate the scene. That instinct made him iconic, but to Martin, it made him unreliable. Over the years, Martin remained diplomatic, never to criticize Murray publicly, but his silence was telling, especially when he praised other peers with warmth. Murray's name rarely left his lips. Comedy to Martin demanded trust, and Murray with all his genius gave him hesitation instead. Two men, two masters, two philosophies. Together, they could never share a stage without friction, and that unspoken distance became the story. Number 5. Robin Williams. Steve Martin and Robin Williams were great friends off-screen, but their professional rhythm simply didn't always work in harmony. Martin once acknowledged he'd look for oxygen when the improvisational storms of Williams hit in some joint performances. Their comic relief appearances were legendary, but behind the laughter, Martin's painstaking tempo often buckled under Williams' chaos. Love was there, so was frustration. On stage, Williams was a lightning strike. He leapt into accents, voices, entire universes without warning. Martin, who treated comedy like architecture, found himself struggling to hold the frame. He would later say performing next to Robin felt like trying to whisper during a thunderstorm. Audiences adored the contrast, Martin's dry wit against Robin's manic fire. But for Martin, the balance was exhausting. Their two most famous collaborations, including the comic relief telecasts of the 1980s and 1990s, alongside Billy Crystal, were perfect expressions of that dynamic. Martin played anchor, Crystal the bridge, and Williams the storm. Together, the three made millions for charity and left an indelible mark on popular culture. But veterans of those events say Martin often abbreviated jokes, tightening his lines in anticipation of Robin's inevitable interruptions. The laughter on stage was real, but so were the compromises. Off stage, their friendship was deep and real. Martin cherished Williams' kindness and his vulnerability. He would often describe him as a man who gave more love than he kept for himself. Yet even in friendship, Martin would confess, sometimes he longed for Robin to pause, let the silence breathe. Comedy for Martin was rhythm and space. For Williams, it was flood and overflow. The tension was never hostility, only the strain of two masters built for different stages. Martin loved Williams' humanity, mourned him profoundly, and never denied his genius. But he also admitted that it came at a cost to share a spotlight with him because when Robin Williams stepped onto the stage, the air itself shifted. For Steve Martin, that brilliance was both gift and burden, the kind of force you loved as a friend but endured as a partner. Number 6. Jim Carrey. When Jim Carrey exploded onto the scene in the 1990s, studios saw him as the new heir to slapstick, a role Steve Martin himself had once carried. But Martin was never impressed, saying Carrey's comedy was not for him, which mostly meant he did not like the rubber-faced excess of it. For Martin, comedy was elegance and understatement. For Carrey, it was spectacle. That difference, though it was never personal, became philosophical, a quiet dismissal that Martin never later retracted. Carrey's rise was meteoric. Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber. He represented a brand of physical comedy that hadn't taken over Hollywood in decades. To younger viewers, it felt new. To Martin, it felt like déjà vu, an echo of Jerry Lewis's broad gestures amplified into chaos. Whereas Martin had made his career on stillness and restraint, Carrey tore through the frame with energy that demanded submission. Martin once described his style as building comedy out of silence. Carrey, by contrast, treated silence as an enemy. Every pause filled with sound, motion, or distortion. On the late-night couches where both appeared, the contrast was striking. Martin, dry and minimal, landed jokes with surgical timing, while Carrey bounced off walls, performing faces that seemed to stretch beyond human bone. To audiences, both worked. To Martin, only one felt like art. There were whispers in the industry that studios considered pairing them. Carrey's box office magnetism against Martin's veteran grace. But Martin reportedly resisted, convinced their energies would clash. He didn't begrudge Carrey's success, but he refused to share the frame. To Martin, comedy wasn't about domination. It was about harmony. Carrey didn't harmonize. He overwhelmed. With time, Carrey proved he could do drama in movies like The Truman Show and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Even then, Martin's silence on his work spoke volumes. Respect may have grown, but admiration never followed. To Steve Martin, Jim Carrey was a future he did not want comedy to become. Bigger, louder, faster, a spectacle without stillness. And that was a stage that Martin chose never to stand on. Steve Martin's story is not about grudges, it's about rhythm. Every clash, from the arrogance of Chevy Chase, the chaos of John Belushi, the ego of Jerry Lewis, the aloofness of Bill Murray, the storm of Robin Williams, to the spectacle of Jim, Carrey wasn't just personal. It was philosophical. For Martin, comedy was never noise. It was music precision, timing, and trust between performers that made laughter inevitable. When the trust broke, the bond never formed. What remains is not the bitterness, but clarity. Art is fragile, and even in laughter, there are lines that cannot be crossed. Steve Martin protected his craft by remembering who broke the rhythm. And that memory, more than any feud, became his legacy. Asterisk, which clash surprised you most? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories from Hollywood's Behind the Frame.